Hi, babushka. Oh, the guy singing here, right here. I know you don't like country, but who's singing here is somebody who was your grandfather John's favorite, absolute favorite performer. Roy Clark kind of looks like my dad, too. And in this song, which was his favorite out of all the Roy Clark songs, it's called Yesterday When I Was Young. And it's odd too because this performer was born in 1933, so he was 10 years younger than your grandfather. But there's a special opening with that song where Roy Clark says, "It seems like the love I've known has always been of the destructive kind." So that leads to something about the next argument I had with your grandfather. And boy, this is a doozy. We were listening to that music together during another weekend of visiting. And it was at the time of after Christmas vacation and going to the new school where I was living at in Houston. And determined to get a job waitressing in that town at a particular cafe that was hooked up to a bar. And, your grandfather supported that, and I'll explain why later, because it's very similar with something that he did when he was young, and he knew the value of that kind of job, and he knew it would make me happy. The other relatives, they just didn't get it. But let's see here. This argument, there's an old-timey term that your grandfather would use, and I use it too. You probably remember from your childhood, sometimes it would slip out of me, called moxie. Old school term. It was also a brand of soda pop back in the day too, in the beginnings of Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper and what have you. But the term moxie means to have some courage, a little bit of strength that's very powerful, that just pops out. During this argument, I flicked out a little bit of moxie at him. We were listening to that music together, which I enjoyed. I didn't mind, even though he couldn't understand my taste in music whatsoever. I listened to everything, including old school big band too, and I loved, everything from Pink Floyd to the Velvet Underground to Sinead O'Connor, everything, the Pogues, what have you, Fleetwood Mac and Journey, and I was listening too on the side to funk and soul and hip hop. But I didn't mind listening to your grandfather's music whatsoever. It was all gorgeous. You know. Oh, also Lisa Lisa and the Cult Jam, which used to drive your grandfather absolutely nuts, or Orange Juice Jones. Oh well. It got to the point where if he would rant about it, I would turn it up a little louder, and these were times too where I had a safe space with him. The monsters I was telling you about, they weren't in the house. And any other monsters were far away enough where I felt safe. So, again, we're going to do something symbolic here. Just get rid of the monsters. The conversation with your grandfather it began because we would sit and talk about his growing up. And we would talk about dolls, which he loved. Actually, this is a modern version of a type of doll. And your grandmother, Sarah's mom, the other Esther, she is in a photograph of what is called a Cupid doll. And your grandfather, John, he had a Cupid doll. And he said they were very popular back in the day, especially for kids who were poor. They were given away as prizes at carnivals and what have you, stuff like that. And, you know, we would talk about the old movie houses that he would go to and the different introduction, you know, called serial shows. That's what he called them, the serials, starting with the letter S. They were chapter films, something of a little bit of entertainment. And also in the movie houses before the big show, they would have newsreels and what have you, stuff like that, informative stuff for people to watch. He said he could take a date, you know, to go see a show on a dime. And you could get popcorn and you could get a soda and plus the ticket for only a dime. Amazing stuff. He remembered the prices of things, and as I'm getting older, I tend to remember the prices of things too, and I tend to rant about it, you know, because the cost of living, as you well know, has gone way up. I'm so glad I penny pinched. And your grandfather, John, he penny pinched too. I used to think that it was because of that time period, because there was a worldwide Great Depression when he was a little boy. He was born in 1922, and the big economic crash, you know, the big collapse, it happened in 1929. So, how do I begin with this one? We were talking about the Cupid dolls and his childhood. And he would go through old photos of him as a child being bathed outside in a little aluminum tub with his siblings out in the yard. And he would also talk about how he was actually born in that house, you know, that I grew up in and where he grew up in too. And I kept asking questions. And when you try and keep secrets in the family secret, when you have a curious teenager who doesn't want to just let it go as it is and Pollyanna the thing, you know, romanticize everything, it's hard to just kind of keep on the same old story or the planned story, you know, the make-believe of everything was good kind of thing. He would always compliment his, you know, his grandmother, my great-grandmother Belle. Everything she did was perfect. She would make everything from homemade root beer to, you know, her homemade jams and how everything was, almost award winning. I would oftentimes ask him about my grandmother, too, the other Esther, his mom. I never knew her. She died too young, and I never knew exactly how. All I knew was that she had died of pneumonia. Well, I cracked the crab. It was around the fourth time. I didn't mean to. And I loved him. But I wanted to get more answers. Now, oftentimes the stories about his mother would fall short. This portrait here, this is of the three sisters. And the oldest one, this was taken in 1912. You remember this portrait because it hung on the wall above the huge wood stove in the house where we lived when I was married to that bad person. It was a short marriage. And ironically, this is a joke. When I was going through my divorce, he tried ridiculously to claim all the family heirlooms that I had. I don't know why. Just crazy. But this photograph was actually in my parents' bedroom. On the other side of my room, there was a door that led to that room. It was actually a guest room, originally, back in the day. And it was convenient because when I was a child and I would wake up from strange dreams or I'd be cold, I could sneak through that door and crawl in bed with my folks to get warm. And then eventually my mom would take me back to my room to go back to sleep, But oftentimes I would see this portrait as a child next to, a portrait of Our Lady, of Saint Mary on the wall too. But I would see those girls and I would get really curious. I kept asking him questions, and he gave me a gift, an old postcard. Now, this photograph was taken in 1912. That house was built in 1900. So, Esther here, she's 12 years old. Now, these are her sisters. So we have Lily in the middle, who became a nurse eventually. She died young too, under tragic circumstances, but it was after she had gotten married and she had a son. And then the younger one, the one, ironically, she has the blonde hair, but she has the Native American points. This is Goldie. She was 4 years old in that. So we also have Lily at the age of 10, and then we have Esther at the age of 12. Now Goldie, when she was 6 years old, she died. And as I would prod and pry and ask questions, and my father would answer them, he'd get on a roll. He would explain to me, without knowing how he was explaining to me, that the disease of diphtheria, they called that the leather throat because you got a lot of gray matter and you can't breathe, and the inside of your throat gets all leathery and dry. Well, it was a terrible disease that was airborne. It was an awful, awful thing, an awful virus. It actually started occurring earlier than the 1600s, and they have recorded cases of it going back to like 1612, 1613 in Spain and other parts of Europe. But it killed a lot of people, especially children. And getting the vaccine, there was a lot of touch and go. They made mistakes along the way. It took a good like 10 years. I don't think they actually came out with a successful vaccine for it till about the 1920s. But Goldie, you know, in the old cemetery of my hometown, there's one statue of an angel in particular, and that's actually her grave. She had died of that. As my dad was explaining to me about her demise and how it, you know, brought a lot of grief to the family, there was a lot of fear in that area. And it really put a dent and a scar of shame upon his grandparents, and there was a lot of fear. He actually gave me an old postcard. I had found it at first by accident in that old trunk. Do you remember that travel trunk I have? It actually belonged to Lily. I still have it to this day. But I found it kind of, I don't know, hidden in. And I asked him about it. And he wanted me to have the travel trunk as well. But I'll give you a close-up. And there's actually some writing. The writing on the back, you can barely see it, but it's the original ink pen, like when they would dip the ink in the well. But the writing is from 1913. So, here's Esther. You can barely see it because it's so faded and damaged. I like to keep it in glass, but she's in the center there. And it's one of her school friends. She's 13 years old. But one of her school friends had also died of the diphtheria. Scary stuff. But I would prod and I would pry. And I was curious about my father's childhood. I also kept asking questions too. This is when the argument kind of got escalated. I'm like, if there are so many photos and portraits of your mother, where's your dad? We were not really allowed to talk about my dad's dad. You know, one of the Williamsons, we'll call him Eric Williamson. My dad was not named after him in the traditional manner. He was actually named after his father's father, John Henry. And Dad referred to his father as that son of a bitch. He was rarely mentioned around any of the other relatives as well. There is one huge portrait. I don't have it. It's a group photo of his parents' wedding at the old house on the front porch. And this was actually too before the rodeo. So this was around 1920 or so, before your grandfather was born. Your grandfather, he was actually born in that house, in the guest room. You want to know why? Because the marriage from the get-go, even though your dad's dad was seen as an upstanding citizen. He was, you know, a petty bourgeois farmer like the others. He was into a lot of illegal activity, and it was because of a sour economy and then wanting more and more money, and he was also a drinker. He made moonshine, and him and others would sell it to make a profit. This was before the hops were, really used as a major crop later on in the 1930s. They would use things like corn, stuff like that, but they would smuggle it. And this was also the time, too, around the Prohibition era. It was actually before, but you could make a lot of good money selling this stuff. Now, according to him, Esther, it was a whirlwind romantic relationship, and it happened quickly. And when reality came to play, it wasn't what she wanted. And also, the guy was violent toward her. And, they tried to continue it. They'd be separate all the time, and then get back together, and then separate, and then get back together. And she would go home, to the main house where her parents were. And it was good, in the beginning that she had that, especially her mother, Belle. She had something to fall back on. But it was really unstable. So, after her third child was born, that was it. And she was abandoned by that man. Totally abandoned with nothing. And that was such a hard period back then. Like I said, this is right before and during the crash. All three children, so your grandfather's sister and your grandfather's brother and him, had to be separated from each other for financial reasons. And it's a tough pill to swallow. But when your father, because I think the argument, looking back at it, it continued throughout the evening. And I kept prying him with questions as to why. Because I was still angry, understand that. I was still angry about what happened to my mom. And to me, in my heart, it was a way of, I don't know, show me what you got. Tell me things. And I knew, like I said before, all is not gold that glitters. And, or here's a saying, if a house is way too clean, there's something wrong. There's something lying underneath. But he broke down crying. He broke down crying. It was something that was way, way taboo. And this was very common. That happened in a lot of families, especially if you look back to the Victorian times and the beginning of institutions, let's say. So, later on, we're going to fast forward to the future. I don't know if you remember me reading a certain book called The Snake Pit. At the same time, I was telling my experience of this and what have you to my husband. my husband was using what I was telling him as a tool against me, a form of gaslighting too. But the snake pit, let's see. I know from the back of my hand, it was published in 1948. At the same time, a movie called The Snake Pit, based on the book, came out in the theaters, and you might get triggered by watching it. You know, I have a hard time to this day watching the film. I think if you're interested in it, I would recommend the book, or listening to the audiobook. But the woman who wrote it, Mary Jane Ward, trailblazer, she talked about her experiences being in a mental institution and how that affected women in general. See, back in the day, going all the way back during the Victorian period and then forward till after 1948, because this book actually it helped to bring all the problems with this kind of stuff to light, where a lot of things within the mental stuff, it had to be reformed, okay? But, okay, I'm just going to be flat out. Your grandmother, Esther, she was made to go into a mental ward. There is an institution, and as far as I know, it still exists to this day. You can look it up. It's in Salem. The building is actually, it was used for filming, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie with Jack Nicholson. But originally, it was a woman's mental institution. Now, there were laws for many, many, many years that had to do with women. And oftentimes, if there was a problem in a marriage or a problem within a family, usually it was the male in the family. They could use it as a tool against their wife, sister, daughter, put them away. Or if a woman was abandoned by her husband, or if there was a death of a husband or a father or a brother, someone that they depended on financially for stability, because it was, you know this, it was hard for women, especially back then. But they could be put away, if not a workhouse. And back during your dad's time of being a young kid too, there were workhouses. There was not Social Security or SSI or LNI, things to fall back on to help people in their times of need. There weren't programs to try and, get people to, stand on their own 2 feet if you have trouble along the way, something that'll help you. Well, your grandma Esther, she was forced to go into what your grandfather John, my dad, referred to as the funny farm. Not so funny. Very taboo. He wasn't allowed to talk about it. But he knew why. But that had to be silenced too, to keep up appearances. Your great-grandma Esther blessed, that was her maiden name. She wanted so much to have a divorce and to stand on her own 2 feet. It wasn't accepted in that society unless she was the wife of a farmer to keep track of the paperwork and the goings on of the farm. It was taboo for her to have a job and to function. Now, her sister, on the other hand, rebelled and went to school to become a nurse. And that was becoming more and more popular, especially, right before World War I. This was a hard pill to swallow for me. And I assured my dad that I would not talk about it around the siblings or the other relatives or my guardians. It was hard. But she was forced. Papers were signed by her father, although the engineering behind it and the idea, it was all instigated by her mother. Like I said, things don't always appear as they really are. And, in a way, they hid it under the rug and invented stories and a romantic Pollyanna of the whole thing. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. So yeah, I cracked that crab. Very sad. We're going to go forward in the future here around the time you were a little girl, right before the tail end of my divorce. And your grandfather, my dad, would call me often. And often the siblings, my siblings, had no idea. But he supported me on my decision for my divorce. And I told him why. And at that time, too, I was out of the closet, And my dad didn't know how to accept that, but he knew that he had to accept me for who I was. And he knew that the decisions that I made, they all had good intentions, but it was all about pleasing him and pleasing that society that he grew up in. And he was starting to see, because of the trials and tribulations and the pain and anguish that his mother went through, okay? That if things don't get corrected, history tends to repeat itself. But he knew that I was strong enough, and he knew that the laws had changed a little bit, more in favor for women. But I don't know. It's kind of touch and go. I really think it's a class issue. It depends on your station in life and who you're dealing with. With my ex-husband, I was dealing with a narcissist and someone with sociopathic tendencies. I married someone who was very similar to my oldest brother Jack. Really. And that was the beginning of me having to disconnect from most of my family, especially my brothers. if it's broken and you can't fix it, you just can't fix it. Some people just don't change. And as you know, it took me even more years to discover that I was still repeating similar mistakes. But that's okay. This whole conversation, it was shocking, you know, and it turned into more than one conversation about it because I would keep asking questions, you know, and there was a lot of tears and a lot of hugging. And you know, your grandfather was a draftsman, right? Instead of retiring at the normal age of 65, he kept working. He actually worked till the age of 69. As soon as they brought in updated technology for drafting with the computers and what have you, he was too old to get retrained in that field. But his boss appreciated him so much. He's like, you know, John, you can keep working. We'll put you at the front desk because we love how you introduce yourself to people and how you make people feel welcome when they come in, and you know such a history of the area. You're an asset. And he was explaining to me, you know, that he wanted to keep working. It was his way of staying active. He's like, retired or what? He wanted to keep going, and he wanted to have that value. And I supported him all the way with that, you know, and I supported him and appreciated him telling me about these three girls and the reality of it from his side, from his point of view. He didn't know much about it. A lot of people didn't even want to delve into that, you know. It was just something of shame. But during my divorce, actually thinking about it, it was way prior. It began when you were a little baby. Your Aunt Jewel, my sister, her and her husband, well, the house was going to be sold. That house down in Humbleton. They had volunteered, and she felt obligated because I knew about all this stuff. I wanted nothing to do with it. And I was up here in Seattle. And I was the baby anyways. To them, I really had no choice in any of those matters. They did what they wanted, my older siblings. But especially her. She took it upon herself to go through generations and generations of stuff within that house. She found the paperwork. Later on, I think it was during the divorce, she told me about it. And she's like, you know, I've heard rumors and whispers around the community. It's true. And I had to pretend like, oh, that's interesting. Wow. But I already knew. Reading books like The Snake Pit helped me, but it did not lead to any real answers as to why. Now, as I was healing myself about 10 years ago, and it took a long time. It took a lot of self-discovery and a lot of research. And like I said, to this day, I'm still discovering stuff and still learning and you know, figuring stuff out. But I think I may have sent this book to you. I'm not sure. I know I sent one of them in particular. Okay? The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State by Engels. Excellent book. And he traces a lot of this going way back. And he also traces how there was a flip during the beginnings of civilization about how women were regarded in all layers of class society, and how it has had its repercussions over time. And then there's a book here. Maybe I've sent it to you, or maybe I've sent you another book that she wrote. This is by a lady named Evelyn Reed. Okay? About the problems of women's liberation. I could have sent this to you, or I may have sent you another book called Women's Evolution, also by her. Excellent read. Francis actually met her years ago when he was young, during his young activist days. She was a trailblazer. Her and her partner's name was George Novak. And he went to Harvard. He did not finish because he took a working class road along with her. But he's actually in the who's who of intellectuals. Yeah, incredible stuff. Francis met them both, and got to know them a little bit. But I think more needs to be done, in the future to change the social system. I don't want to get into politics, but everything's political. And I think the treatment of women also affects, children. That's a given. Of course, it affects children. But it also affects the treatment of men, good men. But I'll give a quote from this book by Evelyn Reed. Incredible stuff. And in the future, if you're curious or have questions about these things, just text about it, or look it up yourself. Share it with your friends. They may really like this stuff. But there's a quote in the middle of the book, and it says a lot of it. Okay. Family love has become damaged and mutilated in a society of, quote, conspicuous consumption. Okay, that's important. Ruthless competition, class and race, dysfunctions, and the manifold alienations of these conditions breed. Okay, now manifold means many and various. Answered a lot of questions in my mind, and as well as that book called The Snake Pit. I gotta wrap up this video. I've been working a lot lately on my health because I've been putting in overtime at work. So, just so you know, you've started your new job and the weather's changing. You've been in the house, for quite a while. I sent this to you and your husband. I sent you one of these. Use it. Physical therapists, use this now. And I'm just so fortunate I bumped into one to get. And it's great. Really take care of your body. You're going to be on your feet again a lot. You're going to go through some training. So take good care of your health. And, yeah. Incredible stuff. I think if I would have known her, I would have loved her. She was full of talent and warmth She was known to play the violin very well and to be good at piano, all those things. And she loved to ride horses. She would actually ride side saddle. So, on that note, I'm going to talk to you later. And remember that I love you. And don't forget to ring the bell. Take care, sweetie. Bye. I'll see you later.